everyone, welcome to here. Today we're going to talk all about intervals. We're going to talk about how to identify an interval. You know, like the major third or perfect fifth or whatever, things like that. How do you know which one's which? That's what we're going to talk about. So first of all, an interval is the distance between two notes. So it's like the unit of measurement that we use. And each distance could be categorized as either being a major, minor, diminished, or augmented, and either a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh interval. And so how do we know, sorry, I just wanted to go blow my nose. So how do we know which intervals fit in which category? Well, we're going to go through that. So first, let's write out all the letters in the musical alphabet without any sharps or flats. We're going to get into how sharps or flats fit into all this in a moment. So let's start by measuring the distance between the C note and the E note. So there are two parts to an interval, right? The quality, which is diminished, augmented, whatever, and there's also the number part, which is second, third, whatever, right? So between C and E, let's figure out what the number part of that interval is, okay? And to do that, we need to count the letters between C and E. So C, D, E. So that's 3 letters, which means the interval between C and E is a third. So great, that's our number part. We figured that out. That's the easy part. Now let's figure out the quality. So is it augmented? Is it diminished? Is it major? I don't know. Let's see. So to do that, we need to look at the major scale of the starting note. So in this case, that's the C note. So that's the C major scale. And then we have to compare the note that we're measuring, so in this case, the E note, to what type of note naturally appears in the C major scale. So the notes on the C major scale are C, D, E, F, and G. And so we have to look at the E note in C major and see how it naturally lives, right? And the E note in C major is just a regular E, no sharps or flats. And the note that we are measuring against C is also just an E, no sharps or flats, right? So what does that have to do with anything? Well, when an interval is a third, like C to E is, if the note we're measuring against the starting note, in this case that's E, is the matching note within the C major scale, so the starting note scale, we call that a major third. And so why? Well, the thing is, there's a baseline quality associated to each number of an interval. If the note we're measuring matches the note within the scale of the starting note. So, for example, if our interval is a second, third, sixth, or seventh, and the note we're measuring is the matching note within the scale of the starting note, we call that a major interval. Always. It's always called major. So, for example, let's do another one. Let's look at the interval of C to D. Well, to do that, we have to count the letters between C and D, right? So C, D, that's 2. So that means that interval is a second. And since D is the matching note within the C major scale, right? D in C major is just D, regular D, no sharps or flats. That means we call it a major second. So that's great. Those are easy. But now what if we want to measure the interval between the C note and the E sharp note? Interesting. So here's the rule. When a second, third, sixth, or seventh interval are sharpened from how they naturally exist in the starting note's major scale, we call that an augmented interval, okay? So from major, it becomes augmented. Why? Because the note is being sharpened from its natural state in the starting note scale. So in the case of C to E sharp, let's figure out the number quality. So that's C, D, E. So that's a third, right? And since E sharp is sharpened from the way the E note naturally exists in the C major scale, we call this an augmented third. Does that make sense? And so that same rule applies to intervals that are either second, third, sixth, and seventh. So now what if we flatten a second, third, sixth, or seventh interval? What then? What do we do then, you know? Well, the interval quality becomes a minor. Let's do an example together. Let's measure the interval between C to D flat, right? And to do that, we first need to find out the number part of the interval. So C, D, to 2, just 2. So the interval is a second. Now we have to look at how the D note naturally lives in the C major scale, and that is a D natural. So that means that the D flat note that we're trying to measure, right, is flattened from the way it naturally exists in the C major scale. So that means this second interval is a minor second. And now let's do the same example, but starting on the E note. I just want to show you something. I just want to make sure we understand this, okay? So let's figure out the interval between E to F. So to figure out the number part, we need to count the numbers. So E and F, so it's a second. And then we need to look at how the F note naturally lives in the E major scale, since that's our starting note. And that is an F sharp. Well, looky here. That means the F note is flattened from the way that it naturally lives in the E major scale, even though it's not F flat, right? It's flattened. So that means this is a minor second. So I just wanted to show you that. I want to show you that the note doesn't have to be flat for it to be flat. You know what I'm saying? It just has to be flattened. Does that make sense? So to review, the second, third, sixth, and seventh intervals, if the note we are measuring matches the note within the starting note's major scale, we call that a major interval. If it's sharpened from the way it naturally lives in the starting note's major scale, we call that an augmented interval. And if it's flattened from the way it naturally lives in the starting note's major scale, we call that a minor. So great, that covers second, third, sixth, and seventh intervals. What about the fourth or the fifth? What happens then? What are those called? Well, the exact same logic applies, just with different words, okay? So let's do an example with the fifth interval, all right? So let's stick to C as our starting note. And if our starting note is C, a fifth interval will be G, because C, D, E, F, G, that's 5, right? So now we have our number part, we need to figure out the interval between a C and G. So we have to look at the way G naturally lives in the C major scale, and that is just G, natural G. So that means it's a matching note, right? And when we have matching notes in a fifth interval, we call that a perfect. So in this case, C to G is a perfect fifth. And the same applies to a fourth interval. So a fourth and fifth interval, did I say that right? For fourth and fifth interval, if we have matching notes, it's called a perfect. Perfect fourth, perfect fifth. So now what if a fourth or fifth interval is sharpened from the way it naturally lives in the starting note's major scale? Well, we also call that an augmented. So that part's the same as the second, third, sixth, and seventh. So now what if the fourth or fifth interval is flattened? Flattened from the way it naturally lives in the starting note's major scale. Well, we call that a diminished. Ooh, spooky. So let's do an example. Now let's start on a B note this time, just to mix it up. Mix it up, you know? So starting on a B note, if we want a fifth interval, that lands us on an F note, right? B, C, D, E, and F. So now we have to look at how the F note naturally lives in the B major scale, and that is an F sharp, which means this sharp that we're trying to measure is flattened from the way it naturally lives in the B major scale. So that means this interval is a diminished interval. So to review fourths and fifths, if the note we're measuring matches the note within the starting note's major scale in a fourth or fifth interval, that's called a perfect. If it's sharpened, it's called an augmented. And if it's diminished, no. And if it's flattened, it's called a diminished. And so that's it, guys. That's intervals. And that's how to identify them and stuff. It's really simple once you get the hang of it. Just do it. You know what you do? This is what you do. This is what you do, okay? You get yourself a little whiteboard. Okay, we'll write out letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you just pick 2 letters, okay? And then you just go through it. So you count 1, 2, 3, 4, so we know it's a fourth, and then you just write out the B major scale, and then you see what the E note is, and that's a natural, so a fourth is a perfect fourth. Was that helpful at all? Anyways, that's just how you could drill it, you know? Oh, don't forget to go to megantracemusic.com for the 70s and Guitar Study ebook. It's a study book. It has a bunch of theory stuff and chord shapes, scale shapes. It's like a study textbook type thing, you know? This piece is what I like to call Texas. What's your guys' irrational fear? I have one. I don't like seeing man-made objects underwater. Or even big objects, like a whale. Freaks me out. You know, when I was a kid, I had an invisible friend who was the ghost of an old man. He wasn't a real ghost. I made him up. Fully made him up. I was like, I need an imaginary friend. Who's he gonna be? Ghost of an old man. I wonder if you could change outfits when you're a ghost. If I was a ghost, how many pumpkins would I have? If I was a ghost, my haunting method would be, I would put random things in people's houses. Random things. Random things. They would come home and find a jigsaw puzzle, half made on the countertop. I would turn all their socks inside out, always. Every sock is inside out, okay? I would put their tomatoes in the sock drawer and their socks in the oven. I would put their oven in the blender and the blender in their bed. I just think ghost hauntings need a revamp. That's just what I think. I think a little jingle jingle of a keychain, a little slim slam of a door. Get original. So that's all, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for showing up. And I'll see you soon. Toodles.